He thought replacing her would prove he
I
was
filed for
untouchable.
separation.
Instead, it exposed the one weakness he never saw coming. The empire didn't collapse because of regulators. It didn't collapse because of the media. It collapsed because he underestimated the one person who understood its architecture better than he did.
I'm sorry,
By
ma'am.
the time
Access
he
is
realized
restricted.
that, the vote had already been cast. By the time the first light touched the glass towers of Manhattan, Evelyn Whitmore was no longer a wife. She was an inconvenience quietly removed from a narrative her husband believed he controlled. Charles Whitmore had built Whitmore Holdings into a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire, dominating skylines from New York to Miami. Business magazines described him as disciplined, visionary, and strategically ruthless. At charity galas, he spoke about legacy, stability, and family values with polished conviction. Investors admired him. Politicians courted him. The public saw a man who had mastered both wealth and respectability. What they did not see was the midnight meeting inside his penthouse. Evelyn stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the city glittering beneath her like a constellation she had helped him reach. For 25 years, she had been the steady force behind Whitmore Holdings' expansion, reviewing acquisition contracts, advising during downturns, quietly restructuring debt when the 2008 market crash nearly buried them. She had never asked for public credit. She had believed partnership was enough. Charles entered the living room without hesitation. His expression was rehearsed, detached. "We need to discuss something," he said, though his tone suggested the decision had already been made. Evelyn turned slowly. "You mean announce something?" He didn't deny it. "I've filed for separation." The words did not echo. They settled. "Filed?" she repeated. "After 25 years, you don't even give me a conversation?" Charles adjusted his cufflinks as though negotiating a minor contract. "This is evolution, not betrayal." Her eyes hardened, not with tears but with calculation. "Evolution doesn't happen overnight." "It does when you outgrow what you built," he replied evenly. There was no anger in his voice. That made it colder. Evelyn had sensed distance for months, late-night calls taken in his private office, unexplained travel, sudden branding consultations. But she had underestimated his willingness to move without warning. The door to the private elevator chimed softly. Vivian Hart stepped into the penthouse with quiet confidence. She wore a tailored ivory coat, understated but deliberate. Former luxury branding consultant. Media strategist. 10 years younger than Evelyn. Her reputation was built on transforming outdated images into modern dominance. She did not look surprised to see Evelyn. "I didn't expect you here tonight," Evelyn said calmly. Vivian offered a faint smile. "Change doesn't wait for comfort." Charles crossed the room and stood beside Vivian, the positioning unmistakable. "It's better this way," he said. "Clean. Decisive." "For whom?" Evelyn asked. "For the future." That word again, future. He had always spoken of it as something only he could shape. Within hours, the narrative shifted publicly. At 6:12 a.m., photos surfaced of Charles and Vivian leaving an exclusive private club in Tribeca, hands loosely intertwined. The images were too clear, too perfectly timed to be accidental. Headlines followed before sunrise. Billionaire Charles Whitmore embraces new chapter. Whitmore marriage ends after decades. Evelyn saw the headlines while sitting alone in the guest suite she had moved into that night. She noticed something else: the divorce petition had been electronically filed 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks. He had prepared the erasure in advance. When she confronted him with the timestamp, Charles did not deny it. "Preparation prevents chaos," he said. "Preparation prevents fairness," she corrected. Security arrived by noon. Not aggressive, but firm. Instructions had been given to facilitate a smooth transition. Her personal access cards were deactivated discreetly. Staff avoided eye contact. The house she had helped design no longer recognized her authority. Vivian stood near the entryway, watching with composed detachment. "You didn't have to make it theatrical," Evelyn said to Charles quietly. "I'm protecting the brand," he replied. "Scandal damages valuation." Evelyn paused, studying him. "You think replacing me overnight strengthens you? It clarifies my direction." She almost smiled, not from amusement, but from recognition. He believed optics equaled control. If the public saw confidence, the market would follow. If Vivian stood beside him smiling, investors would interpret stability. He did not see the risk embedded in speed. By afternoon, Evelyn's belongings were loaded into a black SUV. She took only what mattered: documents, archived contracts, a leather portfolio she had maintained since the company's infancy. As she stepped toward the elevator, Charles spoke once more. "You'll be taken care of," he said, as if generosity absolved betrayal. "I was never looking to be taken care of," she answered evenly. "I was building something." The elevator doors closed. Inside the penthouse, Vivian moved toward the windows and surveyed the skyline. "You handled that efficiently," she said. Charles nodded. "Narrative is everything." He did not notice the silence in the rooms that once carried Evelyn's quiet oversight. He did not consider how swiftly decisions made for image can destabilize structure. That evening, alone in a temporary suite at a downtown hotel, Evelyn opened a secure folder on her laptop. She accessed corporate filings and estate amendments dated within the last month. Her eyes narrowed. Major estate restructuring had been finalized 3 days before he informed her of the separation. Asset allocations had shifted. Trust provisions adjusted. Control mechanisms rewritten. He had not only replaced her. He had attempted to erase her legally. Evelyn leaned back slowly, her composure unbroken. Charles believed sunrise would mark a fresh beginning. He did not realize it had just marked the beginning of his exposure. Charles Whitmore had always believed he was self-made. He repeated the phrase often in interviews, "I built this from nothing." It sounded powerful. It sounded singular. What he never mentioned was the woman sitting at the kitchen table during those early years, redlining contracts while he practiced investor pitches in front of the mirror. Long before Whitmore Holdings towered over city skylines, there was a cramped Brooklyn office and a failing warehouse acquisition that nearly destroyed them. It was Evelyn who restructured that first commercial deal, inserting liability protections Charles had dismissed as unnecessary. When the seller attempted to withdraw under pressure from a competing bidder, it was Evelyn who discovered the enforceable clause that saved the transaction. Charles celebrated publicly. Evelyn revised paperwork quietly. In 2008, when the financial downturn tightened credit markets and lenders began withdrawing lines of financing, Whitmore Holdings stood on the edge of collapse. Charles panicked privately but refused to show weakness publicly. Evelyn spent 3 sleepless weeks renegotiating debt terms, restructuring payment schedules, and leveraging her former law firm contacts to prevent foreclosure across 3 major properties. At a private dinner during that crisis, Charles had told her, "You think like a lawyer. I need you to think like an empire builder." She had answered calmly, "Empires fall when the legal structure cracks." He laughed at the time. He stopped laughing when the bank signed the amended agreement she drafted. There had been another incident years earlier, a near-fatal lawsuit involving a construction defect at a luxury development. Plaintiffs alleged negligence, and the media circled aggressively. It was Evelyn who advised immediate settlement under confidentiality before regulators intervened. She controlled the narrative long before Vivian Hart understood what narrative management meant. And then, gradually, Charles began absorbing the spotlight alone. Evelyn had been on partnership track at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. Her mentor once told her she was on course to lead the corporate litigation division. She stepped away when Whitmore Holdings began scaling aggressively. Temporarily, Charles promised. "Once we stabilize." Stability came. Her return never did. Now, sitting in the quiet of her temporary residence, Evelyn reopened the prenuptial agreement she had not examined in years. It had been drafted early, when Whitmore Holdings was still vulnerable. She remembered negotiating its language herself, insisting on clarity regarding equity allocations tied to initial capital infusion. Her eyes traced a paragraph buried in the early amendments. Initial equity grants assigned during Year 1 capital formation shall remain separate property and retain associated voting rights unless explicitly restructured in writing by both parties. She read it again. Unless explicitly restructured. Charles had modified numerous estate provisions recently, but he had never formally amended that clause with her signature. A slow realization settled in. She accessed archived corporate records, tracing equity distributions from the company's inception. The early shares, issued before the second funding round, had been converted into non-public voting units during a restructuring she herself had engineered to prevent outside takeover. Those units had not been dissolved. They had simply become dormant. Her phone rang. Graham Lawson's name appeared on the screen. Graham had been Whitmore Holdings' outside financial strategist for nearly 2 decades, loyal to stability more than personality. "I've been watching the headlines," he said cautiously when she answered. "You're handling this quietly." "For now," Evelyn replied. There was a pause. Charles moved quickly with the estate amendments. "I've seen them," she said. "He didn't touch the early equity conversion." Silence. "He forgot," Graham said slowly. "No," Evelyn corrected. "He assumed it was insignificant." Graham exhaled. "He underestimated the paperwork." That phrase lingered. Across town, Vivian Hart was adjusting to her new elevation. She attended a board dinner 2 nights after the public separation announcement, seated to Charles's right, wearing confidence like armor. Cameras flashed as they entered the private club. Board members exchanged restrained nods. Some smiled politely. Others watched carefully. Vivian spoke about modernizing brand perception and realigning executive visibility. She suggested philanthropic initiatives that subtly shifted focus away from family-oriented campaigns historically associated with Evelyn's influence. Charles listened approvingly. But not everyone was convinced. Thomas Avery, a senior board member who had witnessed the company's early fragility, leaned toward another director and murmured, "Speed is rarely stability." The media narrative shifted predictably. Billionaire embraces bold new chapter. Whitmore Holdings poised for rebranding. Articles painted Vivian as rejuvenation. Evelyn was described as dignified but obsolete. Evelyn did not respond publicly. Instead, she finalized her calculations. If activated, her dormant voting shares could influence executive confidence votes. They were not majority control, but in a fractured board environment, they could tip balance. Charles believed replacing her overnight simplified his authority. He did not realize he had replaced visibility, not influence. That night, Evelyn arranged a private meeting with Graham in his Midtown office. She laid the documents across his desk methodically. "Confirm this," she said. Graham reviewed the equity trail carefully. Minutes passed. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed from caution to clarity. "These shares are valid," he said quietly. "And they carry voting weight." Evelyn closed the folder. For the first time since sunrise, something close to calm settled over her. Charles had replaced his wife. He had not replaced the architecture she embedded into his empire. And if he continued believing narrative was control, he would soon discover that structure always outlives spectacle. Vivian Hart had built her reputation on reinvention. For over a decade, she had advised luxury brands that feared irrelevance, aging fashion houses, legacy hotels, elite lifestyle conglomerates clinging to nostalgia. Her specialty was transformation. She did not destroy structures outright, she reframed them, polished them, replaced the narrative without appearing ruthless. When she stepped beside Charles Whitmore publicly for the first time, she believed she was stepping into a role she understood perfectly. Power through perception. But Whitmore Holdings was not a fading fashion label. It was a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire built on long-term trust, conservative financing, and disciplined governance. The foundation beneath it was older and more rigid than any brand campaign she had ever redesigned. Vivian understood Charles quickly. His greatest strength was also his blind spot, legacy obsession. He feared becoming predictable. He feared aging into irrelevance. And most of all, he feared appearing stagnant. "You built stability," she told him one evening in his penthouse study. "But stability doesn't inspire headlines." Charles looked up from a development proposal. "Headlines don't build skyscrapers. They build momentum," she replied calmly. "And momentum attracts capital." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Legacy needs freshness." The phrase struck him exactly where she intended. He had repeated that word for years, legacy. Now she was offering him a more modern version of it. Within weeks, executive reshuffling began. Two long-standing senior vice presidents, both loyal to Evelyn and instrumental in the company's conservative growth model, were reassigned under the pretense of strategic modernization. A third quietly resigned. Vivian recommended bringing in younger executives with stronger media presence and digital fluency. "This isn't about age," she said smoothly during a board dinner. "It's about forward-facing alignment." Charles nodded in agreement. Board members did not openly object. But skepticism surfaced in subtle ways: longer pauses before votes, side conversations after meetings, private phone calls that no longer included Charles by default. Thomas Avery, one of the most seasoned directors, observed quietly. At a private executive session, Avery spoke carefully. "We've seen abrupt leadership changes before. They rarely produce immediate stability." Charles dismissed the tone. "We are evolving." "Evolving or reacting?" Avery asked. Charles's expression hardened slightly. "I don't react." Vivian watched the exchange from across the table, maintaining polite composure. She recognized tension, but she believed tension was proof of movement. Outside the boardroom, she initiated a rapid rebranding strategy. Whitmore Holdings' philanthropic campaigns shifted away from family-focused foundations previously associated with Evelyn. New messaging emphasized innovation, cultural partnerships, and international expansion. Media responded positively at first. But markets did not respond emotionally. Within a month of executive restructuring, Whitmore Holdings experienced minor stock volatility. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to draw attention from analysts accustomed to the company's historically stable performance. "Short-term correction," Charles assured investors during a quarterly earnings call. His voice remained confident. But analysts noticed deviation in tone. Privately, Avery requested a compliance review regarding accelerated asset transfers tied to a newly formed advisory subsidiary. The subsidiary, discreetly established weeks before the separation announcement, carried consulting agreements connected to Vivian's firm. The connection had not been widely disclosed. When the compliance team raised preliminary questions about advisory compensation timing, Charles brushed it aside. "Administrative overlap," he said. "Nothing material." Vivian felt the first flicker of discomfort when she saw the internal memo. "You said this structure was clean," she told Charles later that evening. "It is," he replied sharply. "The board is overanalyzing." "Overanalyzing prevents scandal," she answered. He waved off the concern. "You're thinking too cautiously." The irony passed unnoticed between them. Vivian had entered believing she was the architect of a more dynamic empire. But she had underestimated something fundamental: Whitmore Holdings operated under governance frameworks drafted long before she arrived. frameworks Evelyn had embedded. Meanwhile, public perception continued shifting. Lifestyle magazines celebrated Vivienne as a symbol of renewal. She appeared on the cover of a luxury business quarterly beside Charles, headline reading, "A bold new era for Whitmore." But beneath the surface, scrutiny intensified. Compliance officers noticed unusual timing in asset reallocations, particularly those finalized days before the divorce announcement. Advisory payments routed through the subsidiary showed accelerated disbursement patterns. Avery requested clarification in writing. Charles grew irritated. "This is about my marriage," he muttered privately. "They're politicizing it." "It's about disclosure," Avery corrected in a direct phone call. "You moved assets during a material transition without full board transparency." Charles ended the call abruptly. That night, Vivienne stood alone in the penthouse overlooking the city, watching traffic lights blink far below. For the first time since stepping into Charles's life publicly, she felt something unfamiliar. Scrutiny. She had believed she inherited influence. Instead, she had inherited risk. Early the next morning, an internal compliance alert was formally logged. Subject: Advisory Subsidiary, Transfer Timing Review. The memo flagged unusual asset transfers tied to the subsidiary established under Charles's executive authority, transfers intersecting directly with consulting agreements linked to Vivienne Hart. The alert was subtle, procedural. But it was documented. And once documentation exists inside a corporation that size, it never stays quiet for long. While lifestyle blogs dissected paparazzi photos and financial networks debated whether Charles Whitmore's new era was bold or reckless, Evelyn Whitmore did not grant interviews. She did not attend charity events to reclaim sympathy. She did not respond to the subtle humiliation of being replaced in less than a news cycle. She recalculated. Daniel Croswell's office overlooked Lower Manhattan, discreet but formidable. He was known for one specialty: dismantling corporate overreach without theatrics. When Evelyn walked in carrying a leather portfolio thick with archived agreements, he did not offer condolences. He offered a legal pad. "Start from the beginning," he said calmly. Evelyn did not narrate betrayal. She narrated timelines. Estate restructuring finalized 3 days before separation announcement. Advisory subsidiary formed 2 weeks prior. Executive reshuffle immediately after public narrative shift. Daniel listened without interruption. "You're not looking for alimony leverage," he observed. "No," Evelyn replied evenly. "I'm looking for structural accuracy." Within 48 hours, Daniel's team began mapping the chronology of Charles's recent decisions. Corporate filings, estate amendments, subsidiary formations, consulting contracts, all cross-referenced by timestamp. The pattern was subtle but dangerous. Significant asset allocations had been shifted into a newly created advisory entity days before Charles informed Evelyn of the divorce. The restructuring coincided with consulting agreements linked directly to Vivienne Hart's branding firm. "Asset shielding," Daniel said quietly during their second meeting. "Anticipatory?" Evelyn asked. "Likely. If Charles moved assets in anticipation of marital separation without full disclosure to the board, and if those movements intersected with consulting payments tied to a personal relationship, the exposure extended beyond divorce. It entered fiduciary territory. Forensic accountants were retained under strict confidentiality. They traced payments routed through the advisory subsidiary, identifying consulting fees disbursed before Vivienne's formal introduction to the board as strategic advisor. "That timing matters," one accountant explained over a secure conference call. "Advisory compensation preceding disclosure can trigger conflict of interest review." Evelyn absorbed the information without visible reaction. She had drafted early compliance frameworks herself. She knew what triggered governance thresholds. Outside, public debate intensified around optics. Was Charles entitled to personal reinvention? Was Evelyn simply resistant to change? Social media polarized predictably. Evelyn remained silent. Daniel noticed. "This isn't emotional revenge," he said carefully one evening as they reviewed a draft motion. She met his eyes steadily. "It's structural correction." The distinction mattered. They prepared a narrowly tailored legal motion, not explosive, not theatrical. It alleged potential breach of fiduciary transparency during material life transition, requesting judicial review of specific asset transfers pending full disclosure. The filing would not accuse Charles publicly of fraud. It would simply ask questions the board could not ignore. Meanwhile, Whitmore Holdings' internal compliance team continued reviewing the advisory subsidiary flagged days earlier. Thomas Avery quietly requested supplemental documentation regarding the timing of payments to Vivian's firm. Charles responded curtly. Administrative sequencing. But Daniel's analysis suggested more. A review of estate amendments revealed that Charles had adjusted trust provisions to limit Evelyn's direct influence over certain holdings, again finalized before she was informed of separation. He prepositioned, Daniel concluded. "Yes," Evelyn said softly. "He always does." What Charles failed to anticipate was that prepositioning creates traceable patterns. Daniel leaned back during a late-night strategy session. "If we file this motion, you escalate beyond marital optics. You enter governance scrutiny." "That's where this belongs," Evelyn replied. She was not interested in humiliating Vivian publicly. She was interested in recalibrating power legally. The motion was filed under seal late on a Thursday afternoon, timed precisely before the next scheduled board session. Copies were served to corporate counsel discreetly. By Friday morning, Whitmore Holdings' legal department had requested clarification from Charles regarding advisory compensation sequencing. Vivian sensed the shift first. "You said everything was clean," she told Charles in his office, tension breaking through her polished composure. "It is clean," he replied sharply. "They're overreacting." But the tone of internal emails changed. Words like review, disclosure, and governance began appearing with increasing frequency. Daniel's team continued deeper analysis of corporate bylaws drafted during the company's early growth phase. It was there, buried within shareholder protection provisions, that Daniel paused. "There's something here," he said slowly. A clause inserted during the company's vulnerable early expansion years required mandatory board review if undisclosed advisory entanglements influenced executive restructuring during material life events. Daniel looked up from the document. "Material life events include marital dissolution," he said. Evelyn understood instantly. If triggered, the clause would require formal board assessment of Charles's executive authority during the restructuring period. "Can it activate retroactively?" she asked. "If evidence supports non-disclosure," Daniel replied, "yes." Silence filled the room, not with triumph but inevitability. Charles believed he controlled narrative through speed. He forgot governance is built for delay. Daniel closed the folder carefully. "If this clause is invoked," he said, "it forces transparency at the highest level." Evelyn nodded once. Outside, Manhattan moved as always, traffic relentless, headlines flashing, reputations shifting in real time. Inside Whitmore Holdings, compliance officers drafted a formal memorandum referencing the very clause Daniel had uncovered. It was scheduled for review at the upcoming emergency board session. Charles still believed he was navigating gossip. He did not yet understand he was approaching structural review. And once governance mechanisms activate, they do not operate emotionally. They operate decisively. The boardroom of Whitmore Holdings had never felt smaller, even though the polished mahogany table stretched the length of the glass-walled chamber. Outside, the skyline shimmered in late afternoon light, but inside, the air was dense with suspicion. No one mentioned Charles Whitmore's marriage at first. Instead, they questioned something far more dangerous, his judgment. The emergency session had been called at dawn, and every director knew it wasn't about rumors, it was about liability. Files were stacked neatly before each member, tablets glowing with highlighted timestamps and flagged transactions. At the head of the table, Charles sat composed, fingers interlocked, expression carved in stone. Yet beneath that stillness, something restless flickered. He had controlled hostile takeovers, market crashes, and political storms. But this felt different. This felt personal. Thomas Avery cleared his throat, breaking the silence with deliberate precision. "We're not here to discuss your personal life, Charles," he began, his voice measured but edged. "We're here to discuss why your personal life appears in corporate filings." A quiet ripple moved across the table. A slide appeared on the central screen: emails, advisory memos, and financial transfers timestamped months before Charles had publicly acknowledged any relationship with Evelyn. The implication was clear: advisory entanglement. Conflict of interest. Hidden influence. Charles leaned back, unimpressed. "Are we seriously entertaining gossip dressed up as governance?" he asked coldly. But Thomas didn't flinch. "Why wasn't this disclosed?" he pressed. "That's the only question that matters." Charles dismissed it as opportunistic mudslinging. He accused unnamed competitors of exploiting media hysteria. He framed the timing as coincidence. If every executive disclosed dinner conversations, this company would collapse under paperwork, he snapped. Yet the more he minimized it, the more the room hardened. One director quietly pointed out that Evelyn's consulting recommendations aligned almost perfectly with major acquisition decisions. Another mentioned regulatory optics. Charles felt the shift. These weren't enemies, these were allies who had once toasted his leadership. Now they were calculating risk exposure. The board didn't need proof of wrongdoing. They only needed doubt. And doubt was spreading. By mid-session, the conversation turned strategic. Public relations had reported an uptick in investigative inquiries. Journalists were mapping timelines, comparing public statements to internal documents. The narrative online had begun tilting. At first, sympathy had leaned toward Charles as a powerful executive under attack. Now, commentary framed Evelyn as the outsider who may have been sidelined, manipulated, or silenced. The optics were turning against him. "Perception drives markets," Thomas said quietly. "And perception is shifting." Charles felt a pulse of anger at the mention of Evelyn's name spoken with caution rather than disdain. He had expected loyalty. Instead, he was receiving scrutiny. Vivian, seated 2 chairs away, avoided his gaze for most of the meeting. But when the Financial Council projected potential regulatory penalties for non-disclosure, she finally spoke. Her voice was low, tight. "You said everything was clean." It wasn't an accusation screamed across the table, it was worse. It was controlled disbelief. Charles turned toward her sharply. "It is clean," he insisted. "There's nothing illegal here." Vivian's reply was immediate. "Legal isn't the same as ethical, Charles." That sentence lingered like smoke. Several directors exchanged looks. The fracture was no longer subtle. It was visible. As discussion intensified, Charles began redirecting blame. He referenced external advisors, compliance teams, and legal consultants. He suggested that if documentation had gaps, they were procedural oversights. "We rely on specialists for this," he argued. "If disclosures weren't flagged, that's on them." It was a strategic move, distance himself from operational responsibility. But the board understood the implication. A leader shifting blame signaled vulnerability. Thomas leaned forward. "You're the CEO. Accountability doesn't delegate upward." The room fell silent again. Charles realized he was losing narrative control, and control was everything. Outside the building, reporters had already gathered. Social media speculation surged with every passing hour. Anonymous sources hinted at sealed correspondence. Financial analysts debated potential stock volatility on live broadcasts. The company's communications team requested guidance, but the board withheld approval pending clarification. The delay itself fueled suspicion. Within hours, Evelyn released a carefully worded statement through her own counsel. She didn't accuse Charles directly. She didn't defend him either. She simply emphasized transparency and the importance of institutional integrity. The statement was restrained, dignified, and devastating. Public sympathy pivoted sharply in her favor. She appeared composed. Charles appeared evasive. Back inside the boardroom, tension escalated into confrontation. Thomas outlined the immediate risk: shareholder lawsuits, regulatory audits, potential suspension of executive authority. "This isn't about morality," he said firmly. "It's about exposure." Charles felt the weight of isolation pressing against him. For the first time, he sensed that the room was no longer negotiating optics, it was calculating survival. "You're overreacting," he said, though his tone had lost some certainty. Vivian met his eyes this time. "Am I?" she asked quietly. There was no anger in her expression, only disappointment. And that stung more than any accusation. The final blow came not from a board member, but from legal counsel entering with updated information. Regulators had formally requested disclosure documentation related to advisory interactions between Charles and Evelyn over the past 18 months. It wasn't an investigation yet, but it was the threshold. The request meant scrutiny, timelines, sworn statements. The board members absorbed the news in heavy silence. Charles remained still, but a flicker of calculation returned to his eyes. He understood what this meant: documentation could be interpreted, emails could be contextualized, narratives could be shaped. The fight wasn't over. It was evolving. Thomas closed his folder slowly. "We'll reconvene once we review the documents," he said. "Until then, communications will be centralized." It wasn't a suspension. It wasn't support either. It was containment. As directors began filing out, whispers replaced formal debate. Vivian lingered briefly beside Charles. "You told me there were no loose ends," she murmured. Charles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched the city lights ignite beyond the glass walls, reflecting faintly in the darkened room. "There aren't," he finally said. But his voice carried something new, defiance sharpened by desperation. When the room emptied, Charles remained seated alone. Regulators wanted disclosure documentation. The media wanted a scandal. The board wanted protection. And somewhere within the tightening circle, Evelyn was gaining public ground. He exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. If they wanted documentation, he would give them documentation, on his terms. What no one in that boardroom yet realized was that the real fracture wasn't procedural. It was personal. And Charles Whitmore had never lost a war without retaliation. Reputation erodes faster than wealth when scrutiny begins. Charles Whitmore had built Whitmore Holdings on dominance, precision, and strategic intimidation, but markets were not loyal to legacy, they were loyal to perception. The morning financial networks broke the story of a regulatory inquiry into Whitmore Holdings. The shift was immediate and brutal. Red banners scrolled across business channels, analysts dissected compliance language, and speculation spread faster than facts. The phrase "formal disclosure request" repeated like a drumbeat across broadcasts. Charles stood in his private office watching the live feed as anchors debated whether this was mere governance procedure or the prelude to a deeper investigation. Either way, the damage was underway. Within the first hour of trading, Whitmore Holdings' share price began sliding. It wasn't a catastrophic collapse, but it was steady and public, precisely the kind of decline that signaled vulnerability. Institutional investors called the executive floor demanding clarification. Hedge funds trimmed exposure. Commentators framed it as uncertainty at the top. Markets dislike ambiguity, one analyst declared. Charles muted the television, jaw tight. He understood volatility, he had weaponized it before during acquisitions. But this time, volatility was targeting him. The board's containment strategy suddenly looked like hesitation, and hesitation translated to weakness. By midday, investor relations was overwhelmed. Major stakeholders requested emergency briefings. Pension fund representatives asked whether executive authority would remain stable. One longtime investor bluntly warned, "If leadership becomes a liability, we reassess our position." Charles heard the message clearly. Stability was currency, and his name was beginning to cost more than it generated. The irony burned. For years, his leadership had been synonymous with growth. Now it was synonymous with risk. Vivian appeared on a scheduled financial interview that afternoon, and the distance in her tone was unmistakable. She praised the company's resilience, emphasized governance protocols, and carefully separated corporate integrity from individual narratives. When asked about Charles directly, she replied, "Whitmore Holdings is larger than any one person. Our systems are designed to withstand personal turbulence." It was polished, professional, and devastatingly strategic. She wasn't defending him, she was insulating the institution from him. Charles watched the segment in silence, noting the subtle shift. Vivian was positioning herself for survival. Sponsors began reacting by late afternoon. Two major corporate partners announced temporary suspensions pending clarity regarding regulatory review. Their statements were neutral but firm. Public brands avoided association with uncertainty. Charles's communications team tried to frame the moves as procedural caution, but online discourse was merciless. Hashtags questioning executive ethics trended briefly. Opinion pieces framed the scandal as a cautionary tale of unchecked power. Evelyn's name appeared repeatedly, often accompanied by commentary portraying her as composed and principled. Sympathy was consolidating around her. When Charles stepped onto the stage for a live press appearance that evening, the tension was visible beneath his controlled exterior. Flashbulbs burst in rapid succession as he approached the podium. He had rehearsed calm responses, but the atmosphere felt adversarial. Reporters did not waste time. A journalist near the front raised her voice. Did personal decisions influence restructuring within Whitmore Holdings? Charles inhaled slowly before answering. My private life is irrelevant to corporate performance. The response was clipped, colder than intended. Another reporter pressed further. Regulators seemed to disagree. Why were advisory interactions not disclosed earlier? A flicker of irritation crossed his face. We comply fully with all disclosure requirements, he replied, voice tightening. Speculation doesn't equate to misconduct. The edge in his tone did not go unnoticed. Cameras captured the subtle narrowing of his eyes, the tension in his jaw. In a moment meant to restore authority, his temper surfaced just enough to suggest defensiveness. The clip circulated online within minutes, framed as arrogance under pressure. Behind the scenes, board members exchanged uneasy messages. Damage control was no longer preventative, it was reactive. Investors interpreted Charles's demeanor as volatile. Commentators replayed his phrase, irrelevant, contrasting it with regulatory scrutiny. Every word became evidence in the court of public opinion. Hours later, Evelyn released her own public statement. Unlike Charles's defensive posture, hers was measured and calm. She did not attack. She did not dramatize. She emphasized accountability, transparency, and respect for institutional governance. Leadership requires clarity, her statement read. When questions arise, they deserve answers, not dismissal. The contrast was surgical. Where Charles appeared agitated, she appeared principled. Where he deflected, she invited scrutiny. The narrative tilt intensified. Inside Whitmore Holdings, employees sensed instability. Internal chat forums buzzed with rumors. Mid-level managers questioned whether restructuring decisions would be revisited. Compliance officers quietly reviewed documentation. The atmosphere shifted from confidence to guarded calculation. Charles felt it during a brief walk through the executive floor. Conversation stopped as he passed. Respect had once followed him effortlessly. Now it was replaced with caution. Vivian confronted him privately that night. "You let them provoke you," she said, her voice controlled but firm. Charles paced near the window, city lights reflecting off the glass. "They're manufacturing doubt," he snapped. "I won't validate it by apologizing for nothing." Vivian's expression hardened. "This isn't about apology. It's about perception." He turned toward her sharply. "Perception changes when the facts come out." She held his gaze. "Only if the facts are clean." The comment lingered longer than either of them expected. Meanwhile, sponsors continued distancing themselves. Analysts revised short-term forecasts. Competitors quietly exploited the uncertainty in client negotiations. What began as a regulatory documentation request had escalated into a reputational siege. Charles could feel control slipping, not entirely, but enough to threaten his authority. He began privately reviewing communications, scanning for inconsistencies that could be interpreted unfavorably. Blame shifted in his mind toward advisors who had failed to anticipate optics. Resentment brewed beneath his strategic calculations. Late that night, while the executive floor dimmed and most employees left, an encrypted message was sent from inside Whitmore Holdings to an external legal contact linked to Evelyn's team. Attached were internal emails, conversations discussing advisory overlaps, timeline adjustments, and strategic language revisions. The sender remained anonymous, masked behind secure routing protocols. But the intent was unmistakable. Someone inside Whitmore Holdings had decided that exposure was preferable to silence. And by the time Charles realized that the battle was no longer just external scrutiny but internal betrayal, the documents were already in Evelyn's possession. The billionaire who replaced his wife overnight now faces removal from his own empire. That was the headline running across financial media when the whistleblower emails detonated inside Whitmore Holdings. They were not vague insinuations or fragmented messages taken out of context, they were direct threads between senior compliance officers and executive assistants, referencing override authorization and timeline sensitivity. One message stood out in chilling clarity: proceed under CEO directive. Disclosure to be formalized later. The timestamp predated every public acknowledgement Charles had made about Evelyn's advisory involvement. The implication was no longer interpretive. It was procedural. The board convened before sunrise, summoned not by rumor this time but by documented evidence. Hard copies of the emails were placed before each director, highlighted in precise legal markings. Advisory payments had been processed months before formal disclosure statements were filed. Compliance notes referenced urgency and executive pressure. The language was cautious but unmistakable. Charles had not merely overlooked protocol, he had overridden it. When Thomas Avery began the session, his tone carried none of the earlier restraint. "We are now in a legal review posture," he said plainly. "This is no longer optics. This is governance failure." Charles remained composed, but the calculation behind his eyes sharpened. "Context matters," he replied evenly. Advisory conversations were exploratory. Payments were preliminary and subject to documentation sequencing. Thomas didn't blink. Sequencing doesn't supersede regulation. Another director leaned forward. "Did you authorize compliance to delay formal disclosure?" A pause followed, just long enough to confirm vulnerability. "I authorized operational flexibility," Charles answered. It was a strategic distinction, but the room absorbed it as confirmation. The board's legal counsel outlined their obligation. Under corporate governance statutes, when credible evidence suggests executive override of compliance safeguards, directors are required to review CEO authority immediately. Failure to act could expose them personally. That detail shifted the atmosphere from loyalty to self-preservation. Charles understood what was happening. This was no longer about protecting him. It was about protecting themselves from him. What Charles did not anticipate was Evelyn's move. Quietly, through her legal team, she activated dormant voting shares tied to early-stage equity agreements from years prior, shares that had remained unused but legally intact. They had been structured during the company's formative restructuring, long before personal fractures surfaced. Few on the board had considered them relevant. Now they were decisive. The activation tipped the balance of voting power in ways Charles had not modeled. When the corporate secretary confirmed the adjusted voting distribution, a murmur rippled across the table. "This is opportunistic," Charles said sharply. "She's exploiting a procedural moment." Thomas responded without emotion. "She's exercising shareholder rights." The confrontation escalated quickly. Charles rose from his seat, no longer masking his frustration. "You're about to destabilize a multi-billion-dollar enterprise because of administrative interpretation," he argued. "Markets will punish this." A director countered immediately, "Markets are already punishing us." Another added, "Regulators are watching whether we act." The fracture was complete. Authority had shifted from executive dominance to collective survival. Vivian's absence was noted but unspoken. Her chair remained empty, a silent signal that alliances had shifted beyond repair. Charles glanced at the space once during the debate, jaw tightening, but he said nothing. He understood symbolism. Her absence spoke louder than opposition. Legal counsel recommended an electronic vote to formally determine whether Charles should remain CEO pending regulatory review. The decision would be immediate and binding. Charles exhaled slowly, reclaiming a measure of composure. "If you remove me," he said, voice controlled but edged with warning, "you validate every external narrative attacking this company." Thomas met his gaze. "If we don't, we validate regulatory suspicion." Devices were distributed across the table. The corporate secretary explained the procedure with sterile professionalism. Directors entered secure credentials. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of ventilation and the distant noise of city traffic below. Charles remained standing, refusing to sit as votes were cast. His empire, built through aggression, acquisition, and relentless strategy, was now subject to a digital tally. The results populated simultaneously on each device. Motion to suspend Charles Whitmore as CEO pending investigation passed. The words did not echo. They settled heavily, final and immovable. Charles absorbed the outcome without visible collapse, but the stillness in his posture shifted from authority to containment. Thomas spoke first. "Effective immediately, interim leadership will be assumed by the Executive Governance Committee." Another director confirmed that an external compliance firm would oversee document review. Executive compensation clawback provisions would also be evaluated in light of potential disclosure violations. Charles gave a small, humorless smile. "You think this ends here?" he asked quietly. No one responded. The board had already moved into procedural execution. Security protocols were adjusted. Access privileges were restructured. Communications drafts were prepared. The machine was continuing, without him at its helm. As he gathered his documents, Charles paused at the head of the table. "You're reacting to fear," he said, scanning the room. "Fear makes institutions weak." Thomas answered evenly, "Unchecked power makes them weaker." For the first time, Charles had no immediate rebuttal. Outside, news of his removal broke within minutes. Financial networks interrupted programming to announce the leadership change. Analysts debated whether the move would stabilize investor confidence or signal deeper structural crisis. Shares fluctuated sharply before leveling under cautious optimism. Commentators framed it as accountability in action. Public sentiment, already tilted, consolidated further against him. In a separate office across the city, Evelyn received confirmation of the vote. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded once at her counsel and requested preparation for the next phase. The emails had triggered corporate consequence, but regulatory consequence was still unfolding. She understood escalation. She understood timing. Back inside Whitmore Holdings, interim leadership addressed employees via internal broadcast, emphasizing transparency and cooperation with authorities. The word transition was used repeatedly. Charles watched part of it from a private car as it pulled away from the building that had once symbolized his permanence. His phone vibrated continuously, calls from allies, critics, and opportunists alike. He ignored most of them. Then his legal advisor called with an update that cut through the noise. Federal regulators were expanding their inquiry beyond corporate governance into potential securities violations tied to disclosure sequencing and executive authorization patterns. This was no longer a boardroom conflict. It was becoming a federal investigation. He replaced his wife overnight, but he could not replace the foundation she built. That truth unfolded slowly, not through dramatic spectacle, but through consequence layered upon consequence. 2 days after his removal as CEO, Charles Whitmore released a formal statement announcing his resignation from the board of Whitmore Holdings. The language was polished, carefully engineered by legal counsel to suggest voluntary transition rather than strategic retreat. He cited minimizing distraction and allowing the company to move forward without impediment. Markets reacted with cautious approval. Analysts framed it as necessary closure. But in private circles, everyone understood what it was: containment through surrender. Charles had once moved through elite corridors with gravitational authority. Conferences reshaped schedules around his availability. Policy forums extended invitations months in advance. That network thinned with astonishing speed. Within a week, 2 keynote appearances were quietly withdrawn. A global investment summit replaced his panel with a compliance reform discussion. Invitations that had once arrived embossed and urgent now simply stopped. Social standing, he discovered, was more volatile than equity markets. Reputation, once fractured, recalibrated who answered your calls. Vivian's disappearance from elite gatherings was equally swift. She had been visible at charity galas and policy roundtables, her presence once symbolic of partnership and influence. Now, speculation followed her attendance, so she stopped attending. A prominent foundation removed her from its advisory listing without explanation. A fashion editorial feature scheduled months earlier was postponed indefinitely. The circles that had once welcomed proximity to power now recoiled from proximity to controversy. Charles noticed her silence, but neither addressed it directly. Distance had replaced dialogue. Then came the confirmation that struck deeper than optics. The board formally initiated executive compensation clawback proceedings. Legal reviews concluded that disclosure sequencing failures constituted grounds for partial recovery of performance-based bonuses. The figure circulated privately first, substantial enough to sting, calculated enough to withstand litigation. When the decision became public, commentators framed it as symbolic accountability. For Charles, it was personal erosion. Wealth remained, but control had narrowed. He had spent decades consolidating authority. Now committees were dismantling it line by line. Across the city, Evelyn was approached with an offer few would refuse. The governance committee, restructuring leadership architecture in the wake of scandal, proposed that she assume a permanent advisory role focused on compliance modernization and ethical oversight. It was a strategic invitation. Public perception favored her steadiness, institutional credibility required visible reform. She reviewed the proposal without urgency. Her counsel outlined influence potential, compensation packages, and long-term positioning. She listened quietly. When she accepted, she did so with conditions. The advisory role would be independent of executive compensation incentives. Her remuneration would be standardized and partially redirected toward internal ethics training initiatives. Governance cannot be transactional, she said during the closed session where terms were finalized. It must be structural. The decision resonated. Employees who had watched the corporate unraveling felt something recalibrate. She was not returning for leverage. She was returning for repair. Reforms unfolded deliberately. Compliance reporting channels were restructured to prevent executive override without multi-party verification. Disclosure protocols were digitized with timestamped transparency visible to independent auditors. Board review triggers were automated when advisory payments intersected with executive relationships. It was procedural, technical, unglamorous work. But it rebuilt foundation where perception had corroded trust. Investors responded with measured confidence. Media narratives shifted from scandal to reform. Whitmore Holdings began stabilizing, not through dominance, but through discipline. Charles observed from the periphery. His public silence contrasted sharply with earlier defiance. Advisors urged restraint. Litigation loomed. Regulatory review continued at federal levels, now examining disclosure patterns beyond corporate governance. He maintained a legal posture of cooperation, but privately he replayed events with sharp clarity. The betrayal that stung most was not regulatory escalation, it was Evelyn's composure. She had neither attacked nor retaliated publicly. She had simply allowed structure to expose weakness. Their final private confrontation occurred weeks later in a quiet office overlooking the river, a neutral space arranged through intermediaries. The atmosphere was restrained, almost formal. Charles entered first, posture controlled but guarded. Evelyn arrived moments later, composed as ever. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Charles broke the silence. Was it worth destroying everything? His voice was steady, but beneath it lingered accusation. Evelyn held his gaze without hostility. You destroyed it when you confused image with legacy, she replied. The words did not rise in volume, but they carried precision. Charles exhaled sharply. I built that company from nothing. And you believed that made it yours, she answered. Institutions aren't possessions. They're responsibilities. He paced once, then stopped. You could have handled this privately. I tried, she said quietly. But private corrections only work when ego doesn't override accountability. The tension between them was not theatrical rage, it was finality. Charles had sought dominance. Evelyn had chosen endurance. He had mistaken replacement for resolution. She had understood that foundations outlast faces. Outside that room, Whitmore Holdings continued restructuring under interim leadership, guided increasingly by governance discipline rather than executive charisma. Employees adapted to new reporting hierarchies. Investors recalibrated expectations around stability instead of spectacle. The company no longer revolved around a singular figure. It revolved around systems. Charles left the meeting without further argument. For the first time in years, there was no strategic maneuver immediately available to him. No acquisition to distract markets. No public narrative to dominate headlines. Only reflection, and the slow realization that power without trust decays from within. Evelyn remained by the window after he departed, watching the current of the river move with quiet persistence. She had not sought vengeance in the theatrical sense. She had pursued correction. Yet consequences had felt like revenge to the one who lost control. That paradox lingered in the silence. Ambition builds empires, but character determines whether they endure. Charles had mastered expansion. Evelyn had mastered restraint. One pursued possession, the other defended principle. And when the machinery of power demanded replacement, it revealed something deeper than authority, it revealed architecture. As the city lights flickered on and Whitmore Holdings entered its next chapter under recalibrated governance, one question lingered beyond boardrooms and headlines, beyond scandal and reform. When power demands replacement, what truly defines strength, possession, perception, or integrity? If this story made you question what truly builds power, image, or integrity, then you already understand why these stories matter. Share this with someone who believes success is only about winning. And if you value narratives that go beyond headlines into the psychology of ambition, stay connected, because the next story might feel even closer to reality. Now close the video with this emotionally tricky engagement question. When everything you built is on the line, what would you protect first, your reputation, your control, or your character? I'd really like to know your answer.